one of the organisers of these talks, Yoshi Maezumi from the University of Amsterdam, and the title of her talk is Climate and Human Interactions in the Amazon Rainforest Ecotone.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and see if I share this correctly. Full screen, are we okay? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Brilliant, okay, and I'm just gonna start a timer because this is so much exciting data. I'm gonna try and do my best not to do too much over time. So first of all, just on behalf of the organizers, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who's been joining these talks. We're really, really excited as one of the organizers that can speak for us that everyone's interested in these, and we're having some really nice turnout. So thanks for joining. So today I'd like to talk to you a bit about current research I have going on in the Bolivian Amazon, and particularly focusing on climate and human interactions in a region that's known as the Amazon Rainforest Ecotone. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about where this region is going to be located. But before I do that, I was just wanting to take a moment to say thanks to my team. So I love this African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child, right? And so I think about my research as kind of like my little science baby. And I really do think it does take an entire village to be able to do the kind of research that we do. And these are just some of my collaborators I wanted to acknowledge and say a special thanks to that help make this interdisciplinary research possible. So the Amazon Rainforest Ecotone is going to be a transition from our rainforest vegetation into seasonally dry tropical forest and savanna type vegetation. So similar to the ecotones that Michael was showing in his talk, what we're going to see is a change typically in the amount of precipitation that's happening across this ecotonal region. In our drier vegetation, those ecosystems are going to be more fire prone. So we can have fires occurring there. The fire vegetation is, the vegetation there is adapted to fire. And so it tends to respond and be able to grow back. Alternatively, our rainforest vegetation can also expand if we have, let's say, an increase in precipitation. This would then kind of create a dynamic boundary between these rainforest ecosystems and seasonally dry forest or savanna type ecosystems. And we do see this pattern happen quite a bit throughout the Holocene period. So in addition to this play between natural drivers of lightning-caused ignition with fires and precipitation, my research and what I'm particularly interested in is the role that humans play when they come onto the landscape as a potential ignition source. So as lightning is our natural ignition source, humans obviously are going to be our anthropogenic ignition source. So when they come, what does that do? And don't worry, I'm not going to just talk about fire, although most of you know that's my favorite thing. I will talk about some vegetation dynamics within that, but kind of setting the stage for this climate, fire, vegetation interaction with humans. So when we start thinking about detecting humans in the Amazon, one of the ways that we can do that is through a special kind of anthropogenic soil known as Amazonian dark earths. Now, the natural soils in the Amazon are these types of ferrosols here pictured on the left-hand side. They tend to be really rich in metals, very nutrient poor, very clay dense, as opposed to the types of soils we find associated with archaeological sites. So these soils are going to be a human-made soil. They tend to be associated with archaeological contexts like ceramics. They're organic rich. They have elevated nutrient levels and pH. They typically have a lot of charcoal, high concentrations of charcoal. And in the later Holocene particularly, these soils are associated with crop cultivation. So the way that we're kind of envisioning these soils are being met is that we have fires occurring on the landscape over time. Charcoal, along with food waste, human waste, etc., gets burned up into these soils, and then they get rich in organic content over time. And then as these soils start to get more enriched, they tend to be used and exploited for latter crop cultivation. So we start thinking about the distribution of these soils. Here we have a map that we currently have in review right now. Mark Robinson's leading this one. What we're looking at here is basically the distribution of these ADE soils around the Amazon, as well as some what we're calling ditch enclosures. And I'm going to talk a bit about more of those in just a minute, but this is giving you an idea of where our study site is located. And again, we're going to be on that rainforest ecotone, so you can see that transition from the green color into the white. And this study region is going to be around a lake known as Versailles. And you can see here in our inset some of the sample locations that we have, both for archaeology and for our paleo reconstruction studies. So when we start to think about how we are going to reconstruct human vegetation, climate dynamics, one of the ways that our team has been developing this is through an interdisciplinary approach. And so what we're looking at here is an idealized landscape of the Amazon in this transitional vegetation zone. And starting with the lake paleoecology, most of us here are aware that we're going to be using these lake sediment cores as proxies to reconstruct passage and past fire. And so we have fire activity going on the landscape that produces charcoal. Similarly, vegetation around the lake produces the pollen. All of that winds up in our sediments and accumulating through time at the bottom of those lakes. And then we go out and core these sediments to look at changes in that regional kind of broader scale veg. Now, one of the proxies that we pair this with is what we're referring to as terrestrial paleoecology. And specifically here, what I'm meaning is the paleoecology associated with the archaeological sites. So one of the ways that we can start getting at this is through actual archaeological excavations. And so, for example, the types of, let's say the ADEs are being excavated. We can also do features on the landscape, ceramic context as well, giving us an idea of different phases of material culture, or changes in human history through time. And then the archaeobotanical remains might be represented by our soil profiles that would include the analysis of phytoliths. And phytoliths, these silica bodies from plants, preserve really well in dry soils. They tend to be quite heavy and deposit in situ. So pairing phytoliths with pollen wind up giving us a really nice spatial comparison between more regional representation of veg with more local kind of in situ deposition of the phytoliths. Now, that gives us kind of a nice picture of kind of the ecosystem, what humans are doing on the landscape. And lastly, we add in the paleoclimate archives. And so here as an example, I've added the speleothems from caves, typically using oxygen isotopes to reconstruct changes in past precipitation. Now, there are other types of paleoclimate records we can use, but for our purposes here, we're going to be focusing on speleothems. Now, before I go on to looking at some of the data that we've developed from Versailles, I wanted to take a quick little side note to mention a modified sieving protocol that was developed in 2012 by Whitney et al. To help improve the detection of crop pollen. So for any of you who are doing studies where potentially there are going to be human disturbance indicators and or crop cultivation, I would definitely recommend checking out this paper. Basically what it is a modification of the Faegre and Iverson approach that adds one extra sieving step along in the protocol that helps you to concentrate the large grain pollens. So if you haven't seen these types of pollen grains before, this is from squash, maize, manioc, and sweet potato. All of these grains being very large in size, typically bigger than your 70, 80, over 100 micron range. And so basically what it'll do is help concentrate these really low producing kind of rare types of pollen that improve detection, which sometimes may be the only indicator you might have on a landscape that people were there in the past. So if you want to talk more about that, I'm happy to chat about it in the discussion, but just wanted to draw your attention to that. So let's look at some of the archaeology data. Now, some of the features that we detected on the landscape were these double ditch profiles. These are, you can kind of see here with our human scale there on the profile, basically large kind of dug out enclosures around central villages. Typically these types of features are associated with fortification, increased fortification on the landscape. So we did find this feature around the archaeological site of near Versailles. as well as a lot of ceramics. And so Carla, Jaime's Betancourt, has done a brilliant job reconstructing the ceramic traditions through this the ceramic chronologies for this site. And so we can see here on that left-hand panel that we have these three kind of iconic ceramic features or ceramic traditions that have been identified: the Chocolotal, the Versailles Temprano, and the Versailles Tardío, that look at the changes in material culture through the site. And just to kind of give you an indication of scale, there's this one of the archaeologists on the bottom right-hand side to give you an idea of how big some of these ceramic features that were being excavated were identified. In addition to that, let's hop over to the archaeobotany. And again, these are going to be our soil profiles looking at the phytoliths. And essentially what we're looking at here, two different profiles, one of them being in our Amazonian dark earths, the traditional black earth soils, and then a profile from our Amazonian brown earths. In both profiles, we see the evidence of multiple crops being cultivated. And so the little dots there representing different types of crops, including maize and manioc throughout the entire profile. And then on the left-hand side, we also have charcoal. Is kind of an indication of how much charcoal was going into the ADE profiles in a time slot. In addition to this, something that we're all a little bit more familiar with, the pollen data. So depending on what your research question is, when we start to think about human disturbance on a landscape, there's lots of different ways that we can start grouping and thinking about pollen data. And one of the means or metrics our team has been exploring is thinking about subsistence, so basically what people were eating. And so in some of our previous records, we've grouped together all of the known edible ethnobotanical species, so basically plants that we know people were eating at a particular area. And so you can see there on the far left-hand side, these are all of our edible trees, shrubs, and herbs. The pink dots are representing our actual domesticated species that we found in the core. This is the maize and ipomea, sweet potato. And then on the right-hand side, these are all of our other like non-ethnobotanically useful or edible species that were found. And so again, kind of depending on what we want to do, if we're more interested in just trees or trees and palms or edibles or crops or whatever, we can kind of start breaking this data up into different ways to probe what the pollen record changes are seen through time. So let's start putting this all together. Again, we're going back to that same ceramic chronology on the left-hand side. We're going to add in that soil profile. And for simplicity's sake, we're just looking at the phytoliths from the Amazonian dark earth soils. And again, we've got our crops present there. I'm going to group now the pollen data. And here we're grouping the dark green into all of our trees. The light green is going to be our palms, and then in the background, kind of beige color on the far left-hand panel, we're going to see the herbs. Again, our pollen taxa of crops being the sweet potato and the maize, the ipomea and the maize. I've also added here the pollen accumulation as well as the sediment accumulation in the core. And of course, I have to add in charcoal because that's very interesting to me. And then lastly, our paleoclimate record from the region is going to be the Pumacocha Delta 018 record. And so putting these all together, we can start looking at that same kind of landscape reconstruction, different scales and potentially different drivers of things going on the landscape. So for the sake of time, I could talk about this for the next 10 hours and was actually spending most of the morning chatting with Mark, one of my colleagues, about this because these data are very exciting and just getting just replotted on a new age model. But there's three phases that I want to talk about. Firstly, we're going to talk about the Chocolotal phase. Really important to note here, you'll notice that our paleoecology, the pollen data, is cropped at 2500 cal-BP. This record actually goes back much longer. It's a Holocene record, so it basically covers the last 10,000 years. And we have crop cultivation starting 5,000 years ago of maize. So I'm just cropping here now because we're going to be comparing it with the archaeological ceramics, but do know that there was a previous phase of occupation prior to the formation of the Amazonian dark earths where people were cropping around the lake. So moving forward in time, we're going to look at that Chocolotal phase, and we see that as this ceramic phase enters into the archaeological record, we have the presence of maize, we have calathea and manioc being cultivated as well, both around the lake and at the archaeological site. Now, there's a really interesting change in the cultural tradition up into this Versailles Temprano period, where we have an introduction of a quite different type of ceramic technology. And when this occurs, you'll see that there's that kind of distinct, basically like stepping changes in the record, where we see an increase in the fire activity from our macro charcoal in the lake. This likely destabilizes our soils, and so we have that increase in our sediment accumulation right there. So as the sediment accumulates around the lake, the pollen concentration and our pollen accumulation in the sediments goes down, right? Because we have more mud coming in, there's the same amount of pollen, so that goes down. In addition, we see that subtle decline in our tree taxa in the green bar. This is also coupled with the increase in palms, so that's going to be our light green bar. And the palms here specifically, if we wanted to jump back to that pollen data set we could look at closely, is associated with Mauritia. And this is a species of palm in the area that's actually edible and known to be a staple crop for a lot of people still in the Amazon today. So we see an increase in those edible palms, decrease in trees, increased fire activity, likely to start managing the landscape more intensely. We also have the arrival of that Ipomea pollen, indicating polycultures going on around the lake that could also be influencing that. And then you'll notice that big change in these data sets are not associated with any kind of sharp change in the paleoclimate. It's all kind of staying in that dry earth and present realm. So likely these are all going to be attributed to changes in human land use. Now, as we move up towards this last phase, this Versailles Tardío, we see that this period is actually associated with a shift towards wetter conditions. Archaeologically, you'll remember back that double ditch profile that I was telling you about. This is actually indicating increased fortification around the archaeological site at this time period. And so there's likely, well, this is kind of what we were playing with this idea this morning, you notice that there's an absence of maize pollen around the lake at this time. And so it's possible that there's some larger regional shifts in climate that are occurring on the landscape that potentially are driving populations to start moving around, that may result, or potentially causing increased conflict, that may result in the increased fortification of the villages. And as a result, the crop cultivation we see shift from kind of a more dispersed on the landscape, utilizing both the soils around the lake and the ADEs, to shifting towards the villages, fortifying around those villages, likely to help secure resources, food resource security. And then you'll notice that in the phytolith profile, we actually see quite a big increase in our herb taxa there as well. So that indicates that there's actually greater clearing and more intensely managed phytolith usage around the archaeological site. And again, that we've fortified it, so we're kind of protecting it. So for our purposes today, I'm going to stop there because I'm 2 minutes over on time. So I'm happy to chat more about these data, and yeah, keep your eye on these publications that are going to be coming out hopefully in the next year. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed those talks, and thank you for everyone who's spoken today. So we have time for some questions. The first two that have come in are for Alvaro, so I'm just pasting those into the chat. So the first question for Alvaro: what proportion of the variance is explained by your CCA or PCA axes in the plots?